For the Greeks, wrestling is as ancient as civilization itself. On this channel, we've already talked about Milo of Croton, an ancient Greek wrestler, and his incredible feats of strength and skill that are still talked about thousands of years later. But today, we move a little bit closer to the modern day as we look at a Greek wrestler who in his own time was no less significant than his ancient predecessors. Ladies and gentlemen, the Golden Greek himself, Jim Londos. Before we kick off the video, be sure to like and subscribe. I create documentaries on obscure wrestling history with in-depth research and semi-decent editing. Any and all support for this channel is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Jim Londos's birth name was Christos Theophilou. If that's not pronounced correctly, my bad. Jim was born in Argos, an ancient city in Greece, not to be confused with the retail chain. Born in the year of 1894, Londos came from a large family, which wasn't uncommon at the time. Jim Londos was the youngest of 13 children. His father had been an amateur wrestler and a fairly well-known one in Greece for the time, though information about his father is scarce on the web, other than to say that his father taught him the basic fundamentals of wrestling. With the style of professional wrestling back then being more similar to amateur wrestling, these fundamentals were of great importance to learn. He would work as a shepherd throughout his childhood in Greece, but at age 13 he would run away from home, leaving his family behind. His reasons for doing this seemed to be a disagreement with his parents on where he wanted his life to go. It's not clear whether Jim at this point knew he wanted to be a professional wrestler, but he was certain he didn't want to be a priest, which was what his mother had hoped for, or a soldier, which was his father's ambition for the boy. I should imagine being raised by an old-school amateur wrestler from the 1800s that wants you to be a soldier whilst you work as a shepherd is a pretty bloody tough upbringing. It was the demands of this domestic life that would lead Jim Londos, at the tender age of 15, to venture overseas alone to America. When he arrived in America, in the spirit of the American dream, he took every job he could, living in San Francisco. He worked as an errand boy for a grocer's, he was an electrician, the catcher for an aerobics act, among other things. He was also known to pose nude for artists who were painting the male physical form, or whatever their justification is for enjoying a bit of blue. His job as a catcher for an acrobatic act led him to be introduced to the carnival scene, within which professional wrestling was a very popular attraction during this time. This was right in the middle of when wrestling was slowly changing from a shoot-catch wrestling competition to a worked professional wrestling show. Well, that's if you believe the kayfabe of wrestling history. More on that another time. So Londos learned to shoot, learning catch wrestling within the carnival scene. Catch-as-catch-can wrestling is a style that was developed in Lancashire, England. It reached the United States of America in the late 19th and early 20th century and became very popular with carnival wrestlers and performers. With this superior style, carnival wrestlers could invite locals to try and beat them for a cash prize, only to decimate the local with a hook or submission hold. Anyway, back to Jim Londos. He would train in multiple different wrestling styles, as well as learning jiu-jitsu whilst he lived near Chinatown in San Francisco as a teenager. His abilities as a shooter would be referenced by Lou Thez in his autobiography, which is some high praise. To have one of the greats like Lou Thez have been inspired by Jim Londos proves the capability and respect he had during this era. Thez had, of course, been warned about Londos whilst being an up-and-comer in the mid-1930s, with George Tragos having pulled Thez out of a match with Londos for fear that Londos would try to turn the match into a legit contest and hurt the young Lou Thez. Jim Londos would debut in 1912 and would be known as the Wrestling Plasterer under the name Christopher Theophilus. As a part of the gimmick, he would come down to the ring in overalls as if he was fresh off the job and here to kick some heads in his spare time. However, as time went on, he began to realize that he didn't need such a gimmicky, gimmick. He dropped the name in favor of calling himself Jim Londos, and the gimmick was as simple as him being a no-nonsense professional wrestler, which is all people really needed from him. He started as any wrestler would during that era, not on indies or territories, but on the carnival scene. And to be honest, why the hell don't we bring that back? I swear circuses and fairgrounds would make more money if they also had a big shoot wrestling match as an attraction. Either way, Londos would begin working for promoters and would have more momentum behind his name throughout the 1920s, culminating in his first NWA World Heavyweight Championship victory over Dick Schickat. To clarify, it wasn't the National Wrestling Alliance's title, it was the National Wrestling Association's title. Though the association belt would later be merged with all the other heavyweight titles under the Alliance's belt, This wouldn't happen until Thez would do it in 1948. Either way, Londos would hold the association belt for 1,847 days before losing it in 1935. During this time, he had become a local hero in his native Greece, through both his work in the United States and the massive crowds he would draw when he came home. For example, on December 2, 1928, newspapers reported a crowd at the Panathenaic Stadium of around 40,000 to 50,000 people in attendance, with a headline match of Jim Londos beating Karol Zabisco in a 74-minute brawl. This would be dwarfed by the attendance just short of 5 years later for a headline match between Jim Londos and Kola Kwariani, which reportedly had anywhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in attendance. Other events throughout the 30s, 40s and 50s that had Jim Londos as a headline feature would continue to draw tens of thousands of people. This was no surprise, as in the 1930s in Greece, Jim Londos received an insane amount of media coverage, with some sports papers having 7 issues in a row that Jim Londos would be on the front cover of. And whilst other wrestlers such as George Zacharias, Harry Mamos, and John Naxos would get a mention, it would be to nowhere near the same extent that Londos would be talked about. Londos would also win the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship that had been held by George Hackenschmidt, Frank Gotch, and Ed Strangler Lewis. He won the belt in 1938 and retired without dropping the belt in 1946, his reign lasting nearly 2,628 days. This belt was the first ever World Heavyweight Championship and was originally intended to identify the best catch wrestler, but quickly became a pro wrestling championship. And after the belt was unofficially retired, its lineage was carried over to the Alliance's world title. Jim Londos would go on to retire in 1953, shortly after marrying an American woman named Ava Rochwhite, with whom he had 3 daughters, Diana, Demetria, and Christina. They moved to Escondido, California, settling on a 10-acre site in an avocado grove where he basically lived quietly for the rest of his life, only making public appearances from then on out for charities he was working with. His favorite charity being the Greek War Orphans of World War II, and he was honored by President Richard Nixon and King Paul of Greece for his philanthropy. He would pass away of a heart attack on August 19, 1975, and was subsequently buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park. He is cited by many wrestlers as an inspiration and an influence, and was an integral aspect of wrestling's popularity during the early 20th century. Known for his good looks, impressive physique, and capabilities in the ring, it's no surprise the Golden Greek was as much of a star as he was during his era. And had he been around in our era, Vince would have probably had him dressed in a toga and singing the Greek national anthem on a tour in Turkey. Anyway, that's all we have time for today in our brief summary of the life and times of the legendary Jim Londos. Hope you enjoyed yet another sarcastic Mark upload, and I will see you in the next one.